Okay, we're good.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I really do appreciate you taking time out of a schedule to join a webinar like this. I know you have plenty of things to occupy your time, plenty of good and important things, and then unimportant things that are good time occupiers. We've been rewatching Lost with two of our teenagers, so that's part of how we've been spending time together as a family. And it's a good way for me to move from 3 to 9, a part of what we'll talk about tonight. I'm Jon Singletary, and I am the Dean of our School of Social Work at Baylor, and I've been at Baylor for almost 20 years. That's how I know Arias from her time at Baylor in social work and at the seminary. And I've loved what their church does and love opportunities to connect with Peace of Christ. Just value the ways that they are building community and seeking to change society and transform our experiences. And I'm grateful to be a part of this. And I really am grateful for all of you joining in, spending an evening or two. Hopefully you'll join us both weeks for a conversation like this. So as we get started with the chat on and Q&A open, I'll invite you to join me in conversation that way. So if you have questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A, if you can do that. If you can only type it in chat, I'll try to see it there, but we might be having other conversations in chat, so I might miss the question. So that's why I also have the Q&A open for you to post there. As we're getting started, I want to ask you to just start off by telling me a little bit about what you know about your Enneagram journey. So share your numbers with me in the chat. And if you would also maybe share how you learned your number. So did you do workshops? And if so, with whom? Did you read a book to figure it out? Did you take a test to figure it out? Podcasts. So I'm curious how people have come to learn your number. I have done Enneagram work for about a decade. I started as part of a small group at our church, reading a book by Kathy Hurley and Ted Donson. They're still some of my favorites. Their books, the book we read, book, it's Soul Potential, curious title, but a book I still love. And then they also wrote a book called My Best Self. These are quite dated, so I wouldn't necessarily start with them now, but they are a great resource. And they talk a lot about the Enneagram stances. Sometimes I do workshop on stances. I did that. I included stances in the work I did when I was at Peace of Christ before. After our small group experience, I got connected to a couple people at Baylor who were beginning to do Enneagram work, and we started bringing Suzanne Stabile to campus. Suzanne came every year for almost a decade, and we still try to get her to come on occasion. She's just so busy with her books now. She wrote The Road Back to You, which I see at least a few of you mentioned Knowing Your Number from The Road Back to You, which is great. And then also The Path Between Us is her second book. For people looking for kind of a beginning place, I actually recommend The Path Between Us. It's the shorter of her two books. She's a great storyteller, and it's just easy to follow along. She also has a podcast called The Enneagram Journey and has great guests on her podcast. And so I tell people to read a short book like that, listen to other people's stories, which is what podcasts are all about. And then it's a journey of discernment, of discovering your number. There are tests you can take. I just tell people not to rely too much on the tests. The tests guess for us what our number is based on some quick responses to questions. But Enneagram work is not about quick responses to questions. It's about a slow, introspective journey. And that's just so foreign to how most of us do life. It certainly is for me as a 3. I'm a go, go, go kind of person. So this whole process of Enneagram and thinking more intentionally about spirituality is quite different from typically how I've thought about my faith as a Christian. And so to really do some work paying attention to what are the things that are going well in my life, and then what are the places that get me in trouble. Richard Rohr, another Enneagram writer, his book is simply called The Enneagram. Father Richard writes that success has nothing else to teach us after our 20s. And that was kind of a jolting statement to me. 3s are way too interested in success and looking good, creating an image of positivity and performing in order to look successful. So the idea that success has nothing else to teach us and that we can learn from our failure is quite a challenge to me, a different kind of journey. And Enneagram helps us to see that. It's not StrengthsFinder. For those of you that know it, which is most of you, you know that. It really does focus on some of the more challenging parts of our personality. And that's how it's kind of been designed to be. The psychology of the Enneagram, as well as a lot of its spirituality, is tied to these notions of the passions. The passions were really developed about 50 years ago in South America by Claudio Naranjo and his work from Oscar Ichazo. But even 50 years before that, Georges Gurdjieff in Russia was talking about the sins of the 9 types that grew out of some of the early Christian writings dating back to the 4th century. A lot of Enneagram history is not that ancient. The symbol itself is, but the way we think about it now in terms of personalities is a little bit more of a modern history, about 50 years old. And it really does focus on these passions. The points of struggle in our journey is what invite us to see ourselves more honestly. Because when a relationship doesn't work out well, when we have struggles in parenting or in a marriage, it's not because of our strengths. It really is because of these struggles. When a job isn't going well, it's not because of our strengths. It really is because of these struggles within us. So to be honest and to find a way to be a little more reflective on what those things can help us learn about ourselves is a spiritual journey. So the Enneagram prayer is, God, who am I becoming? Who are you calling me to be? The Enneagram points to your personality, which is not who you were created to be. Your personality is who you've become over the course of a lifetime, but it's not all of who you are. An Enneagram journey, and we use that word intentionally, journey, really talks about moving around the Enneagram diagram. You have a core number, and your number doesn't change. It's always been your number. It will always be your number. It's kind of your magnet that sucks you back in, but it sucks you back into ego. It sucks you back into a dangerous place, but you can't simply get away from it. And you know that you found your number when you know that about yourself, when you kind of squirm and say, ooh, do other people see me that way? I didn't think people knew that about me. You feel like you're being read like a book when you're reading about your number. Learning to see yourself that honestly really is key. Another favorite resource of mine, and one that I use when I teach at the seminary, is a book by Alice Freiling called A Mirror for the Soul. The Enneagram is a mirror for the soul. It's a way to be able to see reflectively who you really are in your deepest self and who God is creating you to be, even more importantly. One of the earliest Enneagram mantras is this idea of non-judgmental self-observation. Non-judgmental self-observation is this idea of being able to see ourselves honestly. Non-judgmental means not beating ourselves up for what we see. And self-observation means it is a tool for yourself. We live in a society that does judgmental observation. We look around and we're judging things all the time. I'm glad I'm not like that. I can't believe that person. Isn't that ridiculous? They look ridiculous. Non-judgmental self-observation, honest reflection of who we are. Just knowing your number is the beginning of that journey. Actually, the beginning of the journey is just beginning to explore who you might be, what your number is. Just asking some of those self-reflective questions, those discerning questions to figure out your number is step one. Knowing your number is step two. And knowing your number is sometimes as far as people go. And of course, the Enneagram has so much more to offer. We'll go to a step 3 tonight. There are a couple of places you can go for a third step. And a couple of those resources that of course you know about, most of you know your number, are wings. Wings are simply the numbers on either side of you. Some of you mentioned your wing as a part of your introduction here, saying that you know your number and your wing. A wing is the number on either side of you. And it can only be that way. So you can't be a 4 with a 7 wing. You can be a 4 with a 3 wing or a 5 wing. And you borrow some of the energy, you take on some of the characteristics of those numbers in kind of a fluid manner. Some people say you have some of those characteristics for part of life, and then you take on some of the characteristics for the second half of life. You take on more characteristics from the other wing. That's kind of been my experience, and my wife would say that is true for her too. Other people have different experiences in terms of how they experience their wings. Some only will say they have one. That's because of the circle around the Enneagram. You are a number, one of the 9 types, but it's not a static point. You move and flux a little bit, and you move around the circle from where your number is. So as a 3, I had more 4-ish characteristics earlier in life, and I have more 2 characteristics now. So I'm kind of circling in that sphere of the Enneagram a little bit. The part we'll talk more about tonight are the arrows. What are the lines across from you? And what do those mean for the sake of this spiritual journey and how we understand personality? Before we go into the numbers, just another couple of things to make sure you know. I said you have one number. If you learned your number from a test, then I would hold it lightly. The tests are not always that accurate. What several tests do is they give you a couple of options of what your number might be. And then you have to do a little more work. So the test could say, well, you could be a 2 or a 7, or you could be a 2 or a 9, or you could be a 2 or a 6, or you could be a 9 or a 5. It gives you kind of your top 3. It rules out some that it's pretty sure you're not, which is good. But then you have to figure out, well, am I a 2 or a 9? Because you can't be both. Am I a 5 or a 9, or a 7 or a 3? And that's where the books are really helpful. So that maybe take a test, then spend some time on a book. The Enneagram Institute website is a great resource for teasing out, okay, I could be this or this, but I really feel like this is more true for me. Is a lot of what the journey is about, is figuring out which number is most reflective of you, which is truly the mirror for how you understand your soul, for how you understand yourself. It's not aspirational. You don't identify a number based on who you want to be. If that were true, we'd probably all be 2s, Paige. But we're not all 2s. The 2s hear that and they're like, no, you probably don't want to be a 2. Because they know that what the Enneagram points out are the struggles. The struggle for the 2 is that need to be needed. That nurturing care for others is because they really struggle with, will people love me if I'm not seeking connection with them? If I misstep in this relationship, will I still be loved? How do I nurture relationships and care for others in order to sustain that? That fear of setting boundaries that you might lose those relationships is the perpetual struggle of the 2. Sorry to pick on the 2s. We all have that kind of a struggle. That's what Enneagram suggests. That's just my way of saying it's not picking a number that you think looks good on you, that would make you feel good. It really is identifying, oh, this is a part of me that does haunt me. It's a part of me that shows up time after time. It shows up when I think I'm doing pretty well, and then things don't go the way I expected them to. Of course, in a time like the one we're in now, we experience some of that. A part of what the coronavirus has done is raised our anxieties. It's triggered so many challenges mentally for us. It's introduced depression. It is traumatic in many ways. There's so many ways that this season that we're all walking through together, but isolated from one another, has shaped struggles related to our mental wellness. So it's a challenge for all of us, but from different perspectives and in different ways. So what are the ways that you're experiencing that challenge right now? It can introduce some opportunities that can help you grow in your number. So that's good if you're experiencing that. But pay attention to both. What are the ways that you see your personality acting up? And what are the ways that you see some growth in your personality? And sometimes that is connected to living into one of those arrow numbers, perhaps more than you have otherwise. There are two things that we sometimes will do in our number in a situation like this. When we are triggered, when we are responding to trauma, when we're responding to stress, when we're experiencing the anxiety or the depression that a situation like this can bring about for us, we tend to not be our best selves is a default without some awareness. That's a part of why awareness practices are so important. Mindful breathing, yoga, centering prayer, all of those are opportunities for us to be centered, be grounded, be present and aware of ourselves and our experiences. And that does keep us healthy. Just being reflective is a move towards health. Being mindful is a move towards health. And that is true whether or not you know your Enneagram number. But if you know your number, then you can see yourself a little more honestly, and that is a move towards health. Second thing to point out is just how we can think about health in terms of your Enneagram personality, in terms of your type. I mentioned the Enneagram Institute. One of the phenomenal resources that they provide are type descriptions for all 9 types. I encourage you to look that up. Go to enneagraminstitute.com and then search for your type description at the very bottom of the page. Go to the type description for the number you think is yours, or if you know your number. You'll get about 4 or 5 pages of resources from them when you do that. Right in the middle are levels of health, and it gives you 9 levels of health. The Enneagram is all about 9s, 3 groups of 3, 9 groups of 9. The mystical power of the number shows up over and over again in the Enneagram. The 9 levels of health show how are you when you're kind of bottoming out and at your worst possible place in your personality. That's a place most of us never get to, thankfully. Most of us kind of operate in an average to slightly healthy space. And our best of days, we're hovering in those healthy 3 categories a little bit more. When we're not paying attention, not that all that aware, we might be hovering in the middle 3 average categories and maybe drop into some of the lower health ones, unhealthy ones, but that's not as common. So you'll kind of want to look at the middle range of behaviors to kind of see how descriptive of you are those characteristics of health that they provide for you. Part of the reason I want to point that out to you is it gives you a way to see yourself more clearly in your number, and it gives you a way to think about some of the movement across the Enneagram that we'll talk about in just a little while. One of the things that we sometimes say in relation to these levels of health is we operate in kind of maybe just above average to average health. Something like coronavirus comes along, makes us anxious, our personality takes over, our egos sometimes take over, and we kind of get a little bit less healthy when we're not aware of that, when we're not really awake to ourselves. And as you become less healthy, sometimes it triggers a move into one of the other numbers. And that's what we'll talk about tonight, is what can you be aware of in yourself that it helps you see some of these transitions. So the Enneagram is about knowing your number, and it's about knowing what two numbers you connect to. So I encourage you to have a diagram of the Enneagram available. Take a second and move your screen so you can Google and get an image of it if you don't have one, so you can see the arrangement of the 9 types. And if you're pretty confident of your number, which two do you connect to? As I'm introducing the arrows, just to kind of see what you know about the arrows, most of you have listed your number. If you would also add to the chat what your number is and what are the 2 numbers you go to. Just because most of us don't have all 9 numbers memorized and what they go to, it can be helpful for us just to kind of see. And this is a way for you to kind of, some of you know it automatically. You're like, oh, I know this. And some of you kind of have to think about it. And maybe if you're with a partner, you can kind of talk about it. So kind of list your numbers. Aurelia is even adding, and for us, even adding a little language to it. Just 3 to 6, 9. I'm not use descriptive words that they're adding. Tea break. All right, I can tell now this will be interesting in a good way. I wish we could interact more in person, but even the chat is good. This will be interesting because I can tell kind of who your teachers have been by how you describe some of this. The language of stress and growth is a common American, California influenced, evangelical influenced, Jesuit to a degree, way of thinking about the numbers. Riso and Hudson are the founders of the Enneagram Institute. They taught Richard Rohr, they taught Suzanne Stabile. If you follow them, then of course you're going to use that language. It's truly one of the ways that the Enneagram has been Americanized. I've started a conversation with Aurelia and a couple of others to kind of discern what are ways that as we think about, particularly this week, but throughout our journey over the past few years, understanding the role of race and culture, and to what extent has my whiteness shaped me and my faith? How are the teachers that I've had, the influences of my life and their culture shaped how I understand things? Am I a white person who has learned from white people? Absolutely. How does that influence or minimize the opportunities I've heard to hear from others? A lot of Enneagram teaching has really been shaped by white Americans with a particular psychological lens that historically is not necessarily reflective of some of the more ancient Enneagram teachings, and it's certainly not reflective of some of the South American roots of the Enneagram. A part of what we'll do tonight as I talk about these arrows that you're highlighting is I'll give you some other descriptions of the language besides stress and security or stress and health. No one used integration and disintegration. That's language that's sometimes common. I don't know if some of you have heard of that. Riso and Hudson also use that language. Stress and growth is the most common. But we'll hear from a couple of other voices that really give a broader perspective and a different way of thinking about the way that the numbers can shape us. And of course, if you know that language, you've probably heard examples of how, Matt, your 6 is a stress number. And you've probably talked about, oh yes, I know what it means in stress to experience 6ness, and 3 and being centered, as you say, or in health, as some people say. So you have examples of that. So it's not to undo it completely and to say that that's wrong. It's just an incomplete understanding. So there's more to those numbers and those arrows than just stress and just health. So a couple of resources I'll share. First, just other names of the arrows. Next week, I'll say this first. Next week, we'll talk about the arrows in one direction and it's the direction that we sometimes call forward. We'll do forward second. We'll hear tonight that you have to step back in order to step forward. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the backward arrows tonight. Next week, we'll talk about the forward arrows. The interesting thing about the forward direction is that while it's forward, it's somewhat negatively been labeled as the stress direction or the stress number. And even worse, it's sometimes been labeled the disintegration number. So what does it mean that that's the stress number if it's forward? Doesn't forward imply growth? Well, yes, and other writers describe it as the growth number. Ranio Pais is a Brazilian Enneagram writer who talks about it as the resolution number. Some people talk about it as the balance number or the integration number. And you'll know that Riso and Hudson call the other arrow the integration number. So people actually use integration for both directions, for both numbers of the arrows. So just to know that there are different names for that arrow. Today we'll be more talking about the back arrow, moving backwards first. Some people call it the back arrow. Some people say that we move against ourselves. Some people call it energizing. Some people call it relaxation. Some people call it the heart point. I like that. Some people call it security. We've seen that in some of your references, and growth. So the back arrow we sometimes call growth. That's the most common reference you've made. And the forward arrow, most commonly you've referred to as stress. What I want us to think about more than just a particular label for an arrow is the idea of movement within ourselves and how the Enneagram is really a reflection of that. Again, if it's a mirror for the soul, what can we see in the Enneagram that can be true for our lives? And the arrows, because historically they've been drawn in both directions, there's quite a bit of movement around the Enneagram. Of course, there are two shapes that make up what the Enneagram is. There's the inner triangle, that's the 3, 6, and 9. And there's the hexad that connects 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, and 7. 3, 6, and 9 is slightly less motion, but therefore it's often seen as faster motion. So sometimes the 3, 6, and 9 will have more access to those 3 points because it's just, there can be more constant motion between them. Matt, I don't know if this is true for you or Aurelia for you. Jordan, I think, would know this, Forrest, but those of you who are 3, 6, and 9, can you see the other 2 numbers pretty easily within yourself? And you might not know right away, but that's a good reflection question. A lot of the questions I want to think about are just good journal questions. So if you're a journaler, I'll give you something to journal about every day this week. And one of them is, how do you see the arrows showing up? Today, how did I see my 2 arrows? Tomorrow, as I look back on the day before, how did I see my arrows? So absolutely, especially the 9, Jordan says. So 3, 6, and 9, you have a smaller range of access points. 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7. You have 2 numbers, but those numbers connect to other numbers. And there's some contrast of perspective in terms of what people say about those numbers. Some will say that you just go to the next number and not beyond that. So a 2 goes to 4 and 8, and that's it. Others say, well, 2 goes to 8, and from your 8, you can also take on 5. That's why 2s sometimes can have 5 energy, is they follow the arrow around. I like that perspective, and that's what Georgios Gurdjieff said, was that all of life is process, and a moving Enneagram is the only alive Enneagram, that a static Enneagram is a dead Enneagram. So the idea of constant movement is something to think about. It's a way for us really to ask ourselves, how do I see all 9 numbers within me? we don't want to necessarily ask that question right away when people are learning their number, because it can detract them from really figuring out what is their core number. And it causes people to just say, oh, I could be all 9 types. Well, yes, in fact, you could be all 9 types, but one of those is like a magnet that has been shaped by your particular passion, that is a true psychological ego fixation that will not let you go. And Enneagram knowledge means identifying what is that passion within me? What is the way that my ego has been shaped throughout childhood and this problematic way that's hard for me to overcome? So you have to know that first. What is my core number? And it's only from there that you can see trying to outgrow that, trying to create health, creating balance in your life is moving away from that number into all of the other 9. But then what life does is it sucks us back into that magnet. It is truly a magnetic force that draws us back in. But then with health, we can try to, again, make our way out and move our way around and experience who are we as God is working within us, as the Spirit continues to shape us. How can you move around within yourself? Inner work within yourself means exploring these parts of who you are and how the Spirit of God is within you. And inner work with the Enneagram means drawing out those lines. I've created an Enneagram labyrinth. If we were doing this in person, I would bring it and lay it on the floor. And I encourage people to walk the labyrinth of the journey of your day or the journey of a week. Start with your core number. 9, you might be making that triangle. But occasionally you get off the triangle and see, oh, I do have some 5-ish characteristics. I do have a little bit of 4 in me. Follow your wings, follow your arrows. You don't need my labyrinth to do that. Draw yourself an Enneagram in your journal and follow the path, doing the inner work of exploring. A couple of other background resources, and then we will get to the 9 numbers. I promise I'll squeeze in a highlight of the 9 before we're done. This is a resource from the narrative tradition. So the psychological tradition is often what we call the Riso and Hudson perspective. The narrative tradition is David Daniels, and another writer who has a website is Peter O'Hanrahan. That's quite a last name. If you're Irish, maybe you know that name. And you might say it with a little more flair than I do. Peter O'Hanrahan. You can Google him and the narrative tradition, and you'll find one of the best websites out there about move with the arrows. He calls this backward direction our relaxation point and our heart point. Uranio Pais, I mentioned him, the Brazilian teacher. He teaches with Beatrice Chestnut. Beatrice is one of the best writers out there on the Enneagram right now. Beatrice Chestnut and Uranio, I'm typing both of their names here. Uranio Pais have just started a podcast together called Enneagram. And they talk through numbers, and you'll hear them say some of what I'm saying tonight. Uranio writes, we must go backwards before we can go forward. And they borrow language from one of the early founders, both Claudio Naranjo and a student of Naranjo's, whose name is Almas. Goes by his first 2 initials, AH, I think, Almas. And he calls this back point as the soul child. So there's a connection between the narrative tradition calling it the heart point and Almas calling it the soul child point. And in Beatrice Chestnut's writing, she talks about both of those. The back arrow, while being a point of security, is an inner resource. It's a place of inner stability. It can be an energizing resource for you. It can be what your inner child needs. Now, it might not be what your inner child received, so you can do some inner child work. You can do some exploring of memories to ask myself as a 3, my resource point, my back arrow is to 6. So does that mean I was a 6 as a child? No. It means I longed for some of that, some of the loyalty, some of the ability to ask big questions, but that wasn't valued for some reason. So it's maybe what I needed, but the passion that I developed instead was the one of, no, we're going to get things done instead of asking questions and connecting to feelings. We're going to focus on what we can do. I became a doer rather than trusting my thinking and feeling perspective. So this number, this back point, soul child, resource, energizing point, can help you reclaim some childhood needs, reconnect to a part of yourself that's been lost. Work that's hard for us to do. But the direction of moving back is essential if we want to make progress forward. How do we make progress forward? If we want to move forward on the lines, we have to step back first. So they completely do away with the idea of growth and stress. And instead, what so many of these writers say, there's 6 or 8 of them, it's becoming the more dominant perspective in the tradition because we're truly looking back at some of the South American original sources in Naranjo and Oscar Chazo. And a part of what they say is that both numbers have equal value. Wiesel and Hudson say that they actually came up with this idea of integration and disintegration in a Q&A session. And then they put it in a book and they wish they never had. And it contributes to their idea of growth and stress. But even they say it's limited, but it's what the popular press picked up. It's what the tradition picked up. But earlier than that was this idea that one number is not a growth number and the other number a stress number. They are both resources for us. And you need them both in different situations. Both can be stressful. It can be stressful to go back to an early childhood memory and explore what am I missing as an adult because of that. That can be as much a stress point as moving forward to the so-called stress number. And both can be a resource for us. And we'll say more about that with the forward moving number next week. We have about 20 minutes left. I'm gonna start making my way through the numbers and hopefully it will give you some new ideas about how you think about your numbers beyond just seeing this as the security number. A part of what we talk is source. So it, again, because it's not a matter of undoing the idea of this being growth or security, it's just broadening it some. You will see how this number can be growth, can be security, but as part of that can be a resource or a childhood heart point that can give you something you need for healing in order to experience the transformation of the other number. And that non-dualistic perspective is absolutely what I think some of these earlier writings emphasize more clearly. I'm going to start with ones and highlight just a couple of high points for each of the numbers as we make our way through, and then we'll see what time we have for questions at the end. The way that I talk about, I'm curious kind of what language people use. Sometimes people say you go to a number. What I'm trying to say about this number is how we draw from it. So instead of saying I go to 6 in security, I'm trying to say, how do I draw from 6 in order to experience healing? I still don't know exactly how I do that, but that's a part of my journal conversations. So ones, how do you draw from 7? Rather than always seeking one right way of doing things, the 7 energy can open you up to multiple possibilities. It can invite you to set aside some of the critical, judgmental perspective of your passion, to let go of some of that body-centered tension that you carry as ones, as body, gut-oriented numbers, allowing you to have a little more fun and go with the flow, taking on the enthusiasm and positive spirit of the 7 that maybe your inner child is longing for. Then you're able to infuse the responsibility of the 1 the hard work of the one with that enthusiastic positivity of the seven. That's a resource. One of the things that is still true is you can have, you can access from this number levels of health. So you have levels of health within your number. And then when you draw from this number, you can also draw from the low side of the number or the high side of the number. So if you slip into the low side of 7, then maybe there's some indulgence. Suzanne often calls it a trap door that you fall through. On the high side is where you have more fun, connecting with people through experiences that are lighthearted. So again, this is a conscious move. This is not something that just happens to you in secure times. Just like your stress number is not something that necessarily just happens to you. It's something you can step into. It's something you can truly draw from. You can ask yourself, how might I need this as a resource? So ones can ask that question. How can I draw from 7 as a resource when I'm feeling the stress, the tension, the responsibility, the compulsion for hard work and self-control? If I want to be open-hearted and open-handed, how can drawing from 7 allow me to do that? 2s are drawing from 4. So instead of spending most of their time paying attention to other people's needs as a way to experience some inner security, here they can draw more from within. They're able to feel their own feelings and make contact with their inner needs. Drawing from 4 can help a 2 feel their own feelings and find a home within themselves. Of course, a 2 can get stuck in the melancholy feelings on the low side of 4, expecting too much from relationships, cloying, Suzanne calls it, she uses that word. Getting stuck in the feels is a possibility for 2s drawing from 4. But on the high side, focusing on the full range of your feelings is absolutely an opportunity for growth for a 2 who's so focused on other people's feelings that it's hard for them to explore and identify and understand the range of their own emotional life. It allows them to consciously recognize the energy of what it means to be a healthy 4, to focus on their own feelings and needs, but without the anxiety that 2s sometimes feel when they're expressing their feelings, and without the need to apologize. Our 2s, when they're emotional, they're quick to apologize for it, sometimes faster than any other number. I'm sorry I'm crying. Sorry, I'm upset. No, own those feelings, 2s. Your 4 is what can invite you to do that. 3s drawing from 6 allows them to open up space for thinking about their lives more reflectively, about their relationships, about where they want to go. It gives them a place to ponder, which is not always comfortable space for 3s who feel they need to be on the go. And of course, stepping into that thinking, if you can do it in a healthy space on the high side, then you're able to do the work of discernment, informed decision-making, rather than just hair trigger, let's go and take on whatever I think will make me successful. 6 can help you develop much more clarity around these kinds of processes. Of course, on the low side, you can take on some of the worst case scenario planning of a 6. You can become suspicious and anxious, unable to trust others. Of course, in this time of Corona, as a 3, I took on a lot of 6 energy, and it wasn't always healthy. So I found myself in places of anxiety, fretting about what was going to happen. What do I need to do to make sure I'm okay, to make sure my people are okay? It's easy to do that. But on the high side, when a 3 is there in that place of loyalty, they don't need to be the center of attention. They can live with a bit more caution and critical thinking, able to work behind the scenes instead of needing to be celebrated for their success. And that is a gift to our 3s. Fours drawing from one, when fours feel secure and appreciated, then their center of gravity can shift from their emotional heart center to the gut center. That's the furthest reach on the Enneagram, from the 4 and the 5 at the bottom, completely away from that gut center up above. From a 4 to draw from 1 really does mean they're coming out of being trapped in their heart and able to trust their gut, moving into a place of body energy, becoming more physically grounded and emotionally calm. Stepping out of being trapped in their heart can calm their heart center and allow them to have this gut groundedness. It can create a place of healthy criticism instead of the cynicism that 4s can fall into. It can give them an orientation towards practical action, which can be a gift for 4s. 4s can become overly critical, but they can also seek improvement and orderliness in life like a 1. They can become hypercritical on the low side, being overly confident in their rightness, focusing on minutia and detail in unhelpful ways. But on the high side, and it can be a choice, a 4 can say, no, this can help me take action. This can help me act on my dreams and experience the reality that is good and flawed at the same time, creating that balance, that holistic perspective for a 4. 5, the neighbor, draws in a similar way from 8. Again, a more body-based connection for a 5 who's in their head. The 4 kind of trapped in their heart center, needing to get out. The 5 trapped in their head, needing to connect to their gut. Drawing from 8 gives them that body-based, assertive perspective within themselves. This detached mental type of 5ness can access body energy in this kind of a move. Sometimes we see it in the fact that 5s are interested in physical activities, outdoor adventures, being in the great outdoors for 4s and 5s is a way of drawing on these two numbers. On the low side, like a 4 connecting to 1, a 5 with 8 energy can be overly critical, can be biting, controlling. But on the high side, they can be assertive and clear when expressing their point of view. It allows them to speak knowledge into action. So it's not just reciting what they know, but it's acting on what they know. It can give them a voice of being able to say, I know what I'm going to do, and the energy to engage that. A gift for our 5s. 6s back on the inner triangle are now drawing from 9. The healthy pondering of the 9 instead of the anxious fretting of the 6, instead of being trapped in their head. Again, the gut orientation that 4, 5, and 6 all access from the gut makes a 6 less worried about figuring things out and needing to control information, and a little more accepting of whatever happens. One of the writers describes it, I think it's Peter O'Hanrahan, describes it copacetic consciousness, that the 6 can access the copacetic consciousness of the 9. They can literally relax into their bodies. Now 6s can overdo it and experience the inertia of the 9. They can get lost in inaction, becoming overly passive, even less likely to make a decision, and that can lead to more anxiety. So that can be a trap for a 6 and 9. But on the high side, being able to relax, being able to allow things to be what they are, being able to own that mantra that it is what it is a part of what a 6 can experience when they're going with the flow and allowing some of the big picture thinking that comes from the 9 energy. And from 5, so kind of the opposite move of what a 5 does. The 7 can be frenetic on a normal day. They are on the go, kind of like 3s. They want to be the life of the party. But drawing from 5, they are going within themselves, inside of themselves, to be more quiet and reflective. Almost all of these moves gives us a sense of balance by connecting us to a different center of intelligence. Remember, so much of our Enneagram centeredness or lack of being centered because of our number means that we are trapped with one center of intelligence being dominant and not in a healthy way. Most of these moves connect you to a different center of intelligence. They don't necessarily draw your repressed center up, but they do help you get outside of yourself. So 7 drawing from 5 helps quiet the mind of a 7. Instead of having all the big ideas, they can think a little more clearly as a 5. On the low side, they might disengage a little too much, retreating and not in a good way. But on the high side, think through some of the negative thoughts that are difficult for 7s to accept and to own. To sit with even some of the feelings that they may be ignoring. More in-depth analysis and a way to temper the excess of the 7 is what they can experience here. 8, a number that absolutely represses their feeling capacity, now has direct access to an emotional centered drawing from 2. It's absolutely true that fear betrayal effective is drawing from childhood experiences that 8s might not even be able to tap into or access why that is the case. So this is truly a resource point, a relaxation point. It might not be relaxing on the journey there, but can be a place of quiet connection for an 8 drawing from 2, accessing their emotional center. 8s have a caring side again, but this allows them to extend empathy in a more genuine way. My wife is an 8. She teaches first grade. Sitting with 6-year-olds, teaching them to read this year virtually absolutely keeps her tethered to this 2-ness within her, keeps her connected to that child heart, that child resource connection, literally by connecting with children, but also mentally, emotionally, allows her to draw instead of just from her gut. She always trusts her gut. It is amazing the way that she can trust her gut. She has allowed her gut to help her buy a car, to put a down payment on a house. I mean, she will follow her gut anywhere. But the emotional center allows her to connect with people first before jumping off some of those cliffs. The low side, like a 2, can be manipulative, and 8 can be manipulative in this space, believing that they know what is best for others, believing they're the best way to help and care for others. But to connect their hearts to what they say. They will still assert decisions, but they will have a care and thoughtfulness that shapes how they go about it. And then 9 from 3 is a move to more active feeling, allowing 9s to have a little relate to others a little more from this heart point to 3. 9s can sometimes recognize their 6 connection easier than their 3 connection. The pondering of a 9 is sometimes more comfortable. Drawing from a 3 is more of a heart point connection, that feeling center. It can be problematic if they take on the chameleon behaviors of a 3. It can exacerbate their merging. All three of these numbers tend to self-deny, self-forget, merge with others in their own way. But on the high side, the 9 drawing from 3 can spring into action, can be able to achieve, can be assertive, and can believe their presence matters, which is what our 9s need to know within themselves, perhaps more than anything. Well, that was a lot in a quick trip, and we are right at 8:30. I didn't give you really any time for questions tonight. We'll wrap it up. I'll stick around if people can to type chat respond. Of course, you can email me next week. We'll try to have some more time then. If homework, hoping you'll be back next week, is pay attention to this number. And don't just pay attention to it as a security number. Pay attention to a range of ways that you can draw from this number in stress as well as in security. When you experience stress, how do you go to that traditional stress number? But how might you also benefit from this number in times of stress? How can you draw from this number in a more holistic and balanced way? It's part of your Enneagram journey, and I'm glad to be on this journey with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jon. And I forgot to introduce you at the beginning. I mean, you introduced yourself, but we had a whole conversation about it. But I know
I didn't even notice.
But thank you so much. That was really, really helpful and definitely dug deeper, get it, than what we've done before as a community. And so I hope everyone will join us back next week as we go even deeper into this conversation. And I love how you let the sun determine the time for you. It's totally dark, so we need to get off now.
I'm outside. I guess I can't.
It's perfect.
I hid away from my screen. I didn't even notice I was getting dark. Wow, I have lights out here. I should have turned them on.
That is so funny. Well, it was perfect timing, and we're gonna post this onto our social media channels so people can go back and rewatch and everything. And then we'll be here, same link, for Thursday, a week from today at 7:30. But thank you again so much.
And I'll bring more lights next week.
Yes.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.